This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Today is our third installment of Animal Hour, our weekly March series about the creatures that live in our region. Each week, we're focusing on a different animal, and this week it is sheep. Our Vermont Edition intern, Anna Berg, a student at the University of Vermont, produced this episode for us. They also took a trip to Yankee Rock Farm in Bridport to hear from two relatively new entrants into the world of sheep farming. Let's take a listen.
Becoming a full-time sheep farmer wasn't always in the life plan for Siri Swanson.
We mostly work with Kingdom Fleece and Fiber. They're up in Hardwick.
Okay.
Really small, but really great.
But after studying animal science at SUNY Cobleskill in Yukon, and later working as full-time sheep shearers, Siri and her partner Colin ran the numbers. They decided that raising sheep full-time might make sense.
Is this like your stuff, or is
This is our stuff. We got all their junk out.
This past summer, Siri and Colin moved their operation, Yankee Rock Farm, to an old dairy farm that Addison County locals might remember as the old Rudder Farm.
Yeah, we filled like 10 60-yard dumpsters full of metal off the lawn. It's been a lot.
Remnants of the old farm stick around, like a huge weathered dairy barn. The sheep at Yankee Rock live on pasture full-time under the protection of two loyal sheepdogs, Otis and Stan, so now the barn is just used for storage.
So I gotta grab some fuel and we can drive this truck down.
Down on the fields, snow is melting and mud season is in effect. It's breakfast time for the flock of 200. Their tiny faces watch us cautiously as we crunch through the mud.
They're due for a move today.
That's Colin Sigmund, co-owner of Yankee Rock.
I give them a little pep talk before we move each time. And
What's the pep talk?
I'm not going to say it because they're going to,
it.
It's come on, girls.
Time to go. Let's go, girls.
Yeah, I tell them they got fresh hay waiting for them.
The flock is mostly ewes, but there are a few rams thrown in, and there's clearly some complicated social dynamics at play.
You know, moms will help each other out almost, or just work together. Sometimes even ewes will try and steal lambs from other ewes, which that becomes a problem. But they have really cool dynamics.
Yeah.
The Yankee Rock flock is made up of mostly Cheviot, Border Leicester, and Finns. Siri and Colin say that breed selection is really important depending on the climate of the farm.
These breeds, I think, are just real good go-getters. They look after themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need a whole lot of pampering.
Sheep like Merinos and Rambouillets, which when you talk about wool is what people want, sort of. Those sheep produce great wool. They're not really adapted to this climate. So if you want to support local wool, you might have to think a little bit outside of the box and look at breeds like this. They do better in the moisture.
Yeah, I know.
Back in the 1800s, towns like Cornwall, Bridport, Shoreham, and Orwell were at the center of Vermont's sheep economy. But the main commodity, merino sheep, found themselves quite unsuited to our state's rainy climate. These days, it's rare to see such a large flock of sheep tucked into the rolling green hills of the Champlain Valley.
And I don't think it's anything to be ashamed of. It's not like a sour part of our history. It's just farmers realizing this animal doesn't really belong here.
Yeah, everyone talks about the boom. They don't talk about the bust.
Yeah.
Siri and Colin care deeply about the environmental sustainability of their operation. That being said, any type of livestock can be harmful to the land, and it takes good farm management to make sure that the practice is environmentally friendly.
I think, again, it comes down to the how.
Yeah.
It all has potential to create a negative environmental impact. But if you do it in a way that feeds the soil biology and feeds soil health, you're going to be able to retain more of those nutrients in the soil profile and keep it from becoming runoff.
Washing away.
Yeah.
So far, keeping the sheep on pasture full-time has proven to be environmentally and economically sustainable.
To haul their poop away and put it back here, they're just naturally spreading their own fertilizer as they go. And it's not concentrated. They move every day or every couple of days, and it gets spread out.
It's all a pretty simple system. Sunlight grows grass, grass grows livestock.
Livestock feed the soil.
Livestock feed the soil, livestock feed us. It's a pretty simple system, and whatever you can do to keep it as simple as possible, I think it benefits everybody involved.
The Yankee Rock duo are first-generation farmers, and they got their start through 4-H programs. They hope that younger generations might also find sheep to be an approachable entryway into farming.
I mean, the reason I got into them when I was a kid in 4-H is because they're like 120 pounds. You know, to a 15-year-old, that's manageable by yourself. You know, you need more fence, more infrastructure, more muscle to handle cattle. Like, just about anyone with a little bit of experience and training can handle sheep.
When Siri and Colin settle into the new farm a bit more, they hope to offer events and workshops about rearing sheep. But in the meantime, they say we humans have a lot to learn from sheep.
You know, people say sheep are dumb, but I think they're so smart. They're all about survival. So when I hear people talk about sheep being dumb, it's because the sheep were trying to get out of like a scary situation. They're working together because one sheep alone, yeah, is very vulnerable, but 200 working together, a lot less vulnerable.
That was Vermont Edition's production intern Anna Berg at Yankee Rock Farm in Bridport. If you have a sheep story to share, you can call in throughout this hour at 800-639-2211 or email us at vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Many of you have already done that, including Sue in Brattleboro, who wrote to us to say that their father had a large flock of registered Southdown sheep in Vermont for many decades. He was also a director and president of American Southdown Breeders Association and a life member of New England Sheep and Wool Growers. The industry has changed a lot, Sue writes, both before he died in 2008 and since. Well, as we just heard in Anna's story, Vermont used to have a much larger sheep economy than it does today. Here to tell us more about that is local historian Mark Bushnell. He's the author of Hidden History of Vermont and It Happened in Vermont, as well as the VT Digger column, Then Again. Mark, welcome.
Thanks, Michaela.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you. So take us back to the early 1800s, if you could, right at the dawn of Vermont's sheep industry. What was going on back then?
Okay. Well, when European settlers first arrived, they were mostly living a subsistence lifestyle, as you could imagine. You know, they'd had to clear fields, clear forest to create fields for their homesteads, and they were only really growing and raising as much as they needed to sustain their families. When they had a little extra, they could barter it for finished goods or anything else. You know, maple sugar if they didn't make it themselves or whatever. Gradually, trade started happening for things like timber and potash and grain, fruit, maple sugar, things like that. But the first agricultural boom, a real concentration in one agricultural industry, was really the sheep craze.
Mm. Yes, the sheep craze, as it's now known. And from reading an article that you wrote for the Rutland Herald a couple years back, I learned that the growth of this sheep economy came out of some world events that took place in the first decade of the 1800s involving President Thomas Jefferson. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's strange. The things in history, one event will trigger another in a way you wouldn't really imagine. And actually, the person I'd probably link it back to is Napoleon,
All
which
right.
is even stranger than Jefferson in a way, because he was rampaging through Spain. There suddenly became a market for merino sheep. Previously, only the nobility in Spain had merino sheep, who were much coveted because they have these extremely valuable coats, because they're thick and very fine, soft wool, just really primo stuff. And Spain was so covetous of keeping that near monopoly that they put severe penalties on anyone who tried to export merinos. But then Napoleon comes in with his army into Spain, and suddenly the Spain's nobility are figuring they might need cash, and also it's better to sell the sheep than to let the French capture them. There was an American diplomat in Portugal named William Jarvis, who learned that merinos, he heard through the grapevine, I assume, that merinos were suddenly available. He contacted an acquaintance, a British officer, and used that guy to get the paperwork to buy these sheep and smuggle them from Spain into Portugal, taking small roads where French cavalry couldn't follow. Very cloak and dagger. And gets them to Portugal, ships them to the United States. where people like Jefferson were saying, we need to find new industries, new ways. He was much more a supporter of, uh, when he said industries, he was thinking agriculture. So
Mm.
he wanted new opportunities for American farmers.
And had even
Um,
banned trade with England for a time, right? In
oh,
retribution
absolutely,
for
yeah.
England seizing some ships.
Yeah, there was an embargo during the run up to the War of 1812, which is about this period. Jarvis bought those ships, those sheep in 1809. He bought 200 originally, and shipped those to the U.S. And he said that he set a price for how much he wanted for, minimum price for each sheep. And then he found out by letter that those sheep had actually um, netted a price of 10 times his asking price.
Wow.
So there was a ready market in America. And he was no fool. There were other people also buying merinos in small amounts or whatever, but he was very careful to ship them over. Um, he was sort of hedging his bets and putting batches of sheep onto different ships because of fear of a disease outbreak on the ship, or maybe the ship would be lost at sea.
Mm.
He ended up buying a total of more than 3,400. He sold about 3,000 of them, must have become a very rich man. He left his post as a diplomat in 1811, and he took 400 of those sheep on and brought them up to Wethersfield, Vermont, where he had a huge farm.
Was Wethersfield in Windsor County. We have a caller calling in with some more history, I think, to add. Phil in Heartland is on the line. Phil, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. My story is a little bit about how the Vermont merino genetics, to this very day, are still present over in Australia and New Zealand.
Hmm.
A couple of years back, I had the opportunity of being out in Colorado/Utah for the shearing of 2,500 merinos on my friend's ranch. That evening, the head shearer, who was from Australia, we were having dinner together, and I mentioned I was from Vermont, and in fact, just up the river from William Jarvis's home there in Wethersfield Bow. And he said, well, in Australia, we have a name for certain rams that have extra folds in their neck, which the Vermont breeders were breeding and put selection criteria to keep those rams. And those rams, according to him, to this day are called those, I can't say it on the air, Vermonters. So just a quick story to sort of say that those genetics that came from Spain into Vermont and created the heyday of sheep in Vermont with all the clearing of 80% of the land cleared. To this day, those sheep still have genetics across the ocean.
Wow, all the way in Australia. Well, thanks, Phil, for sharing that. And yes, I know a lot of Vermont sheep, merino sheep back in the day were sold as breeders. They're very valuable in that way. Phil just mentioned that the sheep really changed our landscape. Mark Bushnell, could you talk a bit about that? I mean, there was this huge demand for wool by the textile industry, lots of woolen mills in New England. How did that change farming practices and our agricultural land?
Yeah, well, what happened was that the successful sheep farmers would start buying up their neighborhood farms, and if the less successful farm, and it really drove up land prices. So these smaller farmers would either move to northern Vermont, or they would move to what they called the West, which is today we'd call it the Midwest. So the farmers that were here would, clear their fields, as the caller mentioned, and they would actually take those stones and pile them on the perimeter of their field. So that's why we have all these beautiful stone walls, which are sometimes in fields, and sometimes a lot of places the forest has grown back, so you'll bump into them when you're walking around. Yeah, it got to the point where by 1840 was the peak of the sheep boom, and there were about 1.7 million sheep in the state, which is like 6 times the state population. Addison County was definitely the capital of this Merino Empire, and they had 11 sheep per capita.
Wow,
Um,
11 sheep per
and
capita. That's incredible.
yeah, I mean, it got so crazy that, I mean, at one point there were people even making counterfeit merinos. They would create this nasty sounding mix of burnt umber, lamp black, and linseed oil, and treat the sheep with them. And I think it was really hard to find. You'd have to have a good eye to know that this was not an actual merino. The counterfeiters came to know it as the Cornwall finish after the Addison County town. Not that the people in Cornwall were doing this, but that's what they were trying to fake.
Wow.
Uh,
Well, when did this booming industry eventually start unraveling? Did the Civil
yeah,
War have any effect?
no, it was before that. It
Okay.
was, I mean, the peak was 1840, and then the next year, the federal government pulls back some tariffs, which had been protecting the domestic wool market. And then 5 years later, they lowered them even more. And at the same time, all these farmers were moving to the Midwest where the land was cheaper and more fertile and more made for these kind of sheep. So the cost of raising sheep was cut in half, and Vermont farmers just couldn't compete. There's one statistic that between 1846 and 1850, something like two-thirds of the state's sheep were slaughtered by farmers who could no longer afford to feed them.
Wow.
There was still money in merinos. It was breeders. Breeders could get rich. And they built those fabulous Greek revival mansions that you can still sometimes stumble into around the state. You might, with the big columns in the front.
Mm-hmm.
And it got to the point where some breeding rams could sell for as much as $25,000 a head, which was an absolute fortune in the era.
Hmm.
And the most prized of these rams even had newspaper obituaries written for them when they died.
Really?
Yeah, they were local celebrities of the sort.
Wow. Well, it's certainly a different era we're in now, but we can still see the effects of this period of Vermont history on our landscape today. And in just a minute, we're going to learn more about all the folks in Vermont who are currently raising sheep for lots of different purposes. Historian Mark Bushnell, thank you so much for joining us, telling us about this history of sheep in Vermont.
My pleasure.
You can find Mark's Tales of Vermont History in his regular column for VT Digger called Then Again. Do you raise sheep or know someone who does? What do you love about these animals? Call in at 800-639-2211 or email Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. David of Putney writes, I have been working 44 years for Green Mountain Spinnery. It processes sheep, goat, and alpaca wool into beautiful yarns. I just want Vermonters to know that these small ruminants save the planet and our soils as our shepherds continue to improve their grazing practices to maximize soil health care for the fiber so we can clothe ourselves with long-lasting natural garments. Coming up, we'll learn more about what it takes to raise a flock today. That's in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are talking about sheep. It's the third installment of Animal Hour, a weekly series we're doing throughout March. At the height of the sheep craze before the Civil War, there were well over 1 million sheep in Vermont, 6 sheep for every 1 person. Now, sheep are a much rarer sight, but they're certainly not gone entirely. If you've raised sheep or people in your family did, tell us about how this animal is important to you. Call in at 800-639-2211. Here to tell us more about today's sheep economy is Amber Reed. She's a sheep farmer at Maplemont Sheep in Barnet and a grazing specialist with UVM Extension. Amber, welcome.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Mark Rogers of Glover. He's the president of the Vermont Sheep and Goat Association, which is a nonprofit agricultural organization that's been around for more than 100 years. Mark, welcome.
Good afternoon, Michaela.
Oh, we're so glad to have both of you here to talk to us about sheep. We just heard about their history in the state, and now let's talk about sheep today. Mark, do we have any sense of how many sheep are in Vermont today compared to the 1800s, or how many people are raising them?
We have some feeling, but one of the projects that the Vermont Sheep and Goat Association is undertaking is working with the Vermont Agency of Ag and UVM Extension to try to conduct a survey because, frankly, no one has a good handle on the number of sheep nor the number of sheep and goat producers in the state.
Mm. And do we know how large most flocks are? Are they as big as they used to be back in the 1800s?
No, most folks that have sheep have 10 or 20. You heard earlier, Siri's got a couple hundred. We have 100 here. A big flock is really anything over 50 or 60 in Vermont right now.
Mm. Amber, how many sheep do you have?
We have about 75 sheep here during the summer when all the lambs are on the ground. So I consider myself to be a small sheep farmer, but you can see that times have changed.
Mm. And what breeds of sheep do you have? I'd love to hear more about the types that are good for this, unique cold and rainy sometimes weather that we get here in Vermont.
So we mostly have Border Leicester sheep, which are very common sheep in England. And actually, if anyone's seen the movie Babe, that's the type of sheep in that
They're
movie.
famous.
So they're famous from that. We mostly have Border Leicester, but we also have Coopworths, which is a breed of, it's actually Border Leicesters mixed with Romneys. And it's, I think, the most common breed in New Zealand, so commercially. But, we've basically selected, English or British Isles sheep tend to do really well in Vermont because we have a similar climate, and they've been breeding those breeds or creating those breeds for a very long time there. So unlike the, dryland sheep like Merinos, which have a much harder time here, or even like Tunisian sheep are very, Tunis are super popular, but tend to have a lot of hoof issues because they're really a desert breed that, doesn't do well in Vermont.
Well, one thing I learned in my sheep research ahead of today's show that was really interesting to me was that Merino sheep, and maybe other types of sheep too, have a cleft lip that allows them to graze on most anything, including really rocky soil. Amber, is that a feature that's unique to Merinos, or do other sheep have that too?
I actually don't know. That's really interesting. Maybe, but it's something we can look up for sure. One thing I do want to say just about sheep generally is, they got a really bad rap in the 70s, and were sort of kicked off a lot of like BLM allotments in Western U.S. because
Bureau of Land Management, like federal lands.
Yeah, because they were considered to be like really bad for the land, like they were overgrazing. But the truth is that because like sheep, like cows, only have bottom teeth and they don't have top teeth, they can't graze incredibly short like horses. Like horses have top and bottom teeth, so they're actually able to graze much shorter. And the truth is that really the manager of the animal is the one who, controls their grazing. And in the wild, that would be, predators, wolves, coyotes, bears. They're the ones keeping, ruminants from overgrazing riparian areas or overgrazing in general because they're, of course, fearful of those predators. So they keep moving on the land. And so in the wild, that is essentially the system that we as rotational grazers are trying to mimic using electric fence. So the electric fence is essentially the coyote chasing that sheep in its rotation through the grassland or away from, streams and brooks and so forth. So it's kind of like there's no perfect animal for grazing. There's only a perfect grazing system. And, so sheep have I feel like have gotten a bad rap in the past and for that, but it's really just the way that you take care of them.
Well, we have a call coming in from Buddy in Underhill. Buddy, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hi there.
Hi. I'm calling because I have been fortunate enough to teach at a school called Poker Hill School in Underhill for about 28 years, and we have always had sheep here. And so the kids get to be exposed to, they help feed them. That's their chore. The kids do the work around here, at least the farm work, some of it. We also have chickens and we have goats and we've had other stuff. But it's just really exciting because we have the person come and shear them once a year, and the kids are very excited about that. We've had teachers in the past, certainly not me, that have the skills with the wool, that have helped kids to card it and to do all that different kinds of stuff. And so I feel really fortunate to have been part of that culture for so long. And I just wanted to let people know that it's out there.
Well, buddy, thank you so much for telling us that and for dedicating yourself to school kids for the past nearly 30 years. That's pretty remarkable. Mark, Buddy there was just talking about ways that they're kind of introducing this younger generation to farming more broadly and also taking care of sheep more specifically. Is that something that you work on with some of the members of the Vermont Sheep and Goat Association, like how to pass this on to the next generation?
Yeah, and actually, it's one of the things as we've gone through, and I was making notes. We're actually doing it with our grandchildren. I'm not sure if you're aware, but last year we imported the first Dutch spotted sheep genetics into North America, and my granddaughters wanted to be here for the birth of the very first ones, and they got to be on television when the reporters came. And so we're trying to build some interest with, personally here with our family. Their 4-H club is coming in May, so that the entire group of them can become familiar. And we've talked as a Vermont Sheep and Goat Association board of directors about trying to instigate some more sheep shows at the local fairs, even if it's just to get some exposure to young people, because 4-H and FFA programs are where most of the children who are interested in any type of agriculture are going to get some exposure. So we're trying to work with those institutions to spread the news about sheep and goats as well.
You mentioned Dutch spotted sheep. If folks don't know what those are, imagine a Holstein and a regular sheep got together and made a very beautiful spotted sheep.
Yeah, I mean, you can Google Dutch spotted sheep and my name and picture, or the picture of my sheep usually come up. But this breed was developed in Holland 200 years ago. And like Amber was mentioning too, we need to select certain breeds for their adaptability for here in our climate. Well, these sheep were developed to work in the wet peat fields that they were developing as they began to establish dikes in Holland. And so this breed of sheep has very strong legs, excellent feet, and their efficiency and growth rate. Fact is, Amber has come up and seen some of my sheep. That's one of the things that we're trying to promote is the efficient conversion, basically, of photosynthesis into edible protein for humans. So, the sun shines, the grass grows, the sheep eat the grass, the sheep grow and make good, nutritious meat for the population. So that's a very important thing in Vermont as we see the decline in dairy farms and the decline in utilization of some of this open land. We think that small ruminants are going to play a very integral part in maintaining this open land and providing value as well.
Well, speaking of the meat, we got an email from a listener named John who writes that they had sheep for many years, and the flock that they owned were purebred registered Clun Forest. They came out of England in the 1960s and have spread across the whole U.S. and Canada. Our meat market, for the most part, has been people from the Middle East that have settled around the Burlington area. They like to eat young prime lamb and cook it on a spit, the same as Americans do a pig roast. Our customers were a big influence in promoting clean, efficient, fast, on-farm slaughter that got the law changed in Vermont a few years ago. Amber, are you familiar with that law change that John's referring to?
Yeah, well, there's some really wonderful itinerant slaughterers that work in the state, including someone by the name of Mary Lake, who's also a shearer. And I think it's really wonderful. It's also it's a lot less stressful for sheep to be slaughtered on their own farm than to have to be trailered to, a processing plant. The one thing I would say is that a lot of us, who sell to restaurants or stores can't actually slaughter on farm. We still have to slaughter, like I slaughter all of my sheep at a, USDA inspected facility because my product goes to stores. And so there's still some, it's like more complicated, right? But if you're selling direct to customers, you can have them come and, you can have a butcher on your farm butcher the sheep, and then, you can compost the offal and the hide and the head or whatever, or you can use all those things. Like some people are really excited about using every part of the sheep, which is of course even more efficient and a good way to keep, dollars in the farmer's pocket. Like those hides are worth something, the skulls, the horns, depending on what breed it is, of course.
It sounds like there are lots of different uses for sheep products in Vermont. We got an email from Laura who told us about the clothing company Muriel's of Vermont. They purchase wool from sheep farmers across the state to make sweaters. What impresses me is their deep respect and care for Mother Earth, Laura writes. When managed well, sheep enrich the land upon which they graze, and many farmers graze their animals not just on their own land, but on that of their neighbors. We just got a question in our inbox from a listener named Dave in Middlebury. He wants to know from both of you if you would recommend raising sheep as a beginner's farm animal, and if so, how to start. Mark, I'll toss that one to you first.
Well, that's a difficult question. One, you heard Siri say earlier that sheep are a small animal and they're easy to manage. However, any animal requires a high degree of management. It's not something that you can just take care of when you want to. It's more complicated than keeping a cat or a dog. So the responsibility that a farmer has, and whether they have 2 animals or 200, is significant. So the care, the well-being, the feed, the maintenance, the nutrition, the veterinary care, it's very complicated. Now, if somebody is invested and willing to make that deep dive into animals, yes, sheep can be very rewarding. But you also hear some people say that sheep were born intent on dying. Because they can be weak. Can be very susceptible to diseases and maladies, and that's where I say you've got to be very invested. You got to be knowledgeable or have resources available, a vet close by. So it's not for the faint-hearted. And I will honestly say, may sound brutal to some people, but if you have livestock, you have dead stock. They're a living, breathing, biological organism, and at times things happen, and despite your best efforts, you will have sickness, disease, and sometimes death. So I don't want to be a downer. That's the reality.
That's the reality. No, I get it. Amber, do you have anything to add there? Should Dave get into sheep farming?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. It's always good to, when you get started on something, because, through extension, of course, I see a lot of new and beginning farmers and people who've been farming for generations, huge farms, tiny farms. And, one thing I would just say is that, if you're going to start with something you don't know much about, like start with a few, don't go right in for 100. And the other thing is that's about sheep that's important to remember is that biologically, the evolution of a sheep is for them to blend in with the flock to survive. If you look sick, you're going to get picked off by predators, right? Like wolves, coyotes, bears, whatever. And so it's really important from the sheep's perspective to not seem sick. So as a shepherd, you really have to learn to read the subtle signs of when a sheep is not feeling well or is starting to have an issue before they show the issue completely, because it's almost too late by the time they're obvious. So I think that's the number one thing to learn as a shepherd is to really pay attention to the subtle signs of the sheep, which could be their ear position, the way they're walking, or if they're acting differently than normal, if they're the last one to walk through, if you move your, if you're moving your sheep every day, if there's a sheep that's the last sheep in the group that's moving every time, last in line, you grab that sheep and check its eyelids and for anemia, which will give you an idea of how wormy they are. And then you can also take a thermometer with you and take their temperature really quick. Like the first thing you should always do is take their temperature, figure out if they have a fever or not, and then you can eliminate certain things. So, the other thing is about sheep that's nice is they are small and they're a bit safer than cows, unless it's like a giant ram with big horns. But they do have flocking behavior, although different breeds sort of behave differently. So some sheep tend to stick in a flock more than others. And so, if you have a dog or not is sort of a choice that you make. The main thing that's hard about sheep is that because they were, evolved in the desert without so many worms, we in Vermont, like in England and other wet climates that have sheep, we have to really be on top of our parasite management. And so a lot of that has to do with, are you doing like progressive grazing management? Like if you're just putting your sheep out in the field and leaving them all summer, they're going to end up getting a lot of worms. And so, a good rotation for shepherds would be like a long rotation where the worms literally like get pooped out, they hatch, and then they don't get eaten and they actually die before they find their host again. So that might take 45 to 60 days or longer depending on the weather. And so that's really hard for people who don't have very much land, is to have a 60-day rotation is complicated.
So if you get squirmy about worms, this might not be the animal for you. I hate to jump in here, but we do need to take one more quick break, but we will continue our conversation on sheep in just a moment. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Today on the show, we are learning about domesticated sheep. It's the third installment of Animal Hour, our weekly March series about the creatures that live around us. We're joined by Mark Rogers of Glover. He's the president of the Vermont Sheep and Goat Association, and by Amber Reed, a sheep farmer at Maplemont Sheep in Barnet and a grazing specialist with UVM Extension. Let's dive right back into the phones. We have Lisa in Colchester on the line. Lisa, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Yeah.
I just had a quick question. It had always been my understanding, like 25 years ago when I lived and worked in the Southwest, that the primary concern with grazing of sheep in that area on the very fragile soils, like the cryptobiotic soils and things, was that the damage came not so much from overgrazing, but from simply the physical damage caused by like hundreds of hooves. And I was just wondering if you guys knew, has there been any, more research into that, or like opinions have changed in the last quarter of a century? And also, is that a concern at all in Vermont? Does erosion happen from just the physical presence of hooves on the soil here? And if so, how do sheep managers here manage that?
Well, thank you, Lisa. And Amber, I'm going to throw that to you, since you've managed farms out west in Colorado as well as back east.
Sure. There's definitely soils, like some of those crypto soils that are, they're really sort of special, that don't, they don't do well with the presence of like large numbers of domestic animals. However, like a lot of what we did out west was essentially like, high level, like rotational grazing with really, really long rest periods. So like we were grazing range, you want to like graze it and then leave it, might be a whole year. And so that hoof action can actually break up a lot of dry and dead material that's sort of floating above the surface, get it down onto the soil. And then when it rains, instead of the soil just being capped and hard and the rain running off, it can actually be absorbed. So there's ways to graze well that actually encourage like infiltration of rain and like regrowth of like natives and, healthy ecosystems in the West. I would say in the East, like one thing is like keeping domestic animals off really steep slopes and away from riparian areas is really important. So like, animals that are close to stream banks and rivers obviously can poop into those waterways, which is really bad for water quality. And also if they're even, basically pooping near them and there's runoff that's going to, water that's going to run into the rivers from those areas. So it's good to keep them, set back from those brooks and streams. The other thing is that animals really shouldn't be grazing on stream banks because they erode the soil, and then those stream banks are like destabilized essentially. So it is important to like be really careful of where you're grazing and how you're doing it. That said, the presence of, high quality, good grazing can be like incredibly positive. and, building soil and, fertility and, growing healthy forage when it's done well. So, and that all has to do with like adequate rest periods between grazing periods and then how short you're grazing. So, not grazing too short is really important. It's actually healthier for the sheep. For one thing, those little short stems close to the ground tend to be really woody. Um, and so, it's not the best nutrition when it's super short. Also, a lot of the worm parasites, I'm going to keep coming back to worms because that's really a big deal in sheep world. But worm larvae, when they crawl up to get eaten by a sheep, is what their hope is. They don't tend to make it that high up. And so if you can keep your animals from grazing shorter than 4 inches, like leaving 4 inches of residual at minimum. Now there are,
if all with all due respect to the worms, I do want to sneak in a couple more callers here. So
Yeah.
let me go to Karen in Hardwick next. Karen, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi there. This is Karen and Kevin Broderick. We are known as Green Mountain Merino here in East Hardwick, and we've been raising merino sheep.
For how long?
We started about 4 years ago. We have a hop yard, so that's why we started in part acquiring the sheep. But the sheep help weed the hop yard. They thin and they defoliate the bottom of the hop bines, the first maybe 3 feet or so, which is good for the hops, and it means we don't have to use any kind of the conventional sprays that would otherwise be used to do that. So that's why we started with sheep. We wanted merino because we've always been fascinated by the history of merino sheep in Vermont, especially.
And, of course, the value of the merino wool. It's so fine. It's sought after. So we figured if we're going to do sheep, we're going to do merino.
I like that. Well, thank you so much for both of you calling in. And Mark, I would love to get your thoughts here. I don't know if you know these folks up in East Hardwick, but
I was going to jump in. Actually,
good.
Driven by their place 6 times this week.
Six times this week.
I apologize. Yeah, I apologize for not stopping in. Yeah, they live just like 8 miles from me. And I also wanted to compliment them because, what they're doing, grazing their sheep in between their rows of their hops and using them for, taking some of the vegetation off is a process that is done in a lot of regenerative organizations or farms. I do some regenerative certifications for a company called The Greener World. And in olive groves and vineyards and other places, they're actually contracting sheep growers. They might have 1,000 sheep or something to come in and do exactly what Kevin and Karen are doing with their flock. So very commendable. The sheep are doing a multifaceted job for them, and then they're getting the benefit of the wool too. So that's the type of thing that we're seeing more interest in sheep. And it's something called solar grazing. A lot of these solar installations that you see around the United States, there's actually an industry that's been developed by sheep growers to graze these solar sites. I think in Massachusetts, it's required that animals graze them. You can't use petroleum-based vegetation removal. And so there may be an increase in the value of the small ruminant industry. And people want sheep in these solar installations. Cattle are too big and goats climb on everything. So sheep are excellent for doing this. So not only in the vineyards and the hops and other things, but they're going to become more notably valued in these solar installations.
I want to share a couple book recommendations that we've gotten throughout today's show. Anne in Montpelier just called in with the title Accidental Shepherd. She says it's about shepherding back in the day. It's by Lise Greensfelder. We also had Chuck from White River Junction call in write in to say that they kept sheep commercially for 20 years at Sunrise Farm before throwing in the towel last year. As much as I adore sheep and feel they are ideally suited to our rolling Vermont landscape, I couldn't make the finances work. I couldn't sell the meat for a high enough price to cover the cost of management. I wrote the book Living with Sheep as a celebration of my love of being a shepherd, which has only made my retreat from raising them all the more heartbreaking now.
If I
Go ahead, Mark.
could comment, yeah. So Chuck actually buys his sheep from me now. He found somebody who wasn't as clever as him to find out what the economics were. So I actually provide the lamb to Chuck for his CSA. I got an email from him yesterday. We've talked about this, but no, it's something that it's hard to, and this is something that I think is really important and hasn't been brought up yet. Chuck brings up a good point. The economics of sheep farming in Vermont are not fantastic. Most sheep farms in the state of Vermont are a sideline project. They cannot economically sustain themselves. You have to do something else. Now, there are 2 or 3, and Siri, they go out and shear. They've got a big group, but most of the rest of us have another source of income so that we can consider ourselves sheep farmers.
I'm curious if that's the case for Diana, who's calling in from Jamaica, Vermont. Diana, we only have about a minute left, but what were you calling in to tell us?
Yeah, I'll be quick. Yep, I'm from Wild Meadow Farm over in Jamaica, Vermont, which I think Southern Vermont doesn't get a lot of agriculture exposure. So I do like to, speak on behalf of the other producers in the area. I have a small farm. I have less than 15 head of sheep. And I think that absolutely same thing that Mark said. The economics aren't great. I'm a beginner farmer. I also farm solo, and I farm on flooded land in Vermont. That's high elevation, very rocky. So I'm also, I've got that issue around runoff that I'm fighting with always. So I think that's important. But on the sidelines, I am also a flower farmer. Oh. So that is my other bread and butter. I also do that in the winter to offset some of my costs when I have my sheep on the winter paddocks and aren't really producing much, and we're waiting to shear. We're waiting for lambs to come.
So you're making it work in lots of different ways. That's great. And thank you so much, Diana, for calling in. Briefly, before we let you go, Amber, I know you have a couple kids there on the farm. Are you hoping to pass down this business to them one day?
We'll see. You know how it is. It's really exciting during lambing season. So like my stepdaughter Ruby pulled a lamb, I think the spring before last, for the first time, and she was like, "I'm going to med school." So she was so excited about pulling a lamb and stuff. And my daughter, of course, thinks it's hilarious, but she's only 5. So anyways. One other thing I was just going to say is
we only have about 20 seconds.
Oh, you do? Okay, yeah, that's okay. We'll save it. There's so much sheep stuff.
We'll save it for the follow-up sheep show. Amber Reed of UVM Extension and Maplemont Sheep Farm in Barnet, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Mark Rogers, the president of the Vermont Sheep and Goat Association. He's in Glover. Mark, thank you.
Thank you very much.
One more email from Rebecca in Middlebury. Rebecca writes, "What we would love people to understand is how smart and emotionally intelligent sheep are. Our sheep know their names, come when called, and understand many words. Each of our sheep has a song written especially for him or her, and they will let us know when they want their song sung to them. They have very strong feelings and deserve all of our best care and respect." Well, thanks so much to everybody for helping us celebrate this animal in our midst today. You can find our previous Animal Hour shows on the Vermont Edition podcast feed. We've talked about beavers, big cats, and next week it is bats. Today's show was directed by Aaliyah Papes. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Anna Berg is our intern, and they produced today's show. Our call screener today was Rick Barrett, and our theme music was composed by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.